I was measuring the temperature of the third water sample that morning when the meter slipped from my hand and hit the ground. Not because I was careless, because what I had just seen around the bend in the creek made 20 years of wildlife forensic experience feel meaningless. A body covered in gray-brown hair, nearly 10 feet long, lay face down among the river stones, one arm stretched toward the water, as if it had been trying to reach the stream. I had examined hundreds of cases involving large animals that died under unusual circumstances. But I had never seen one that made me wonder whether I was standing in front of the first physical evidence of a species. Science had never recognized or evidence of a crime. Many of you have left the same question in the comments. If Bigfoot really exists, why has nobody ever found a skeleton, a body, or any physical evidence that could be brought into a laboratory? Tonight, the story we're about to tell may be the closest thing to an answer ever documented. Hello everyone, I'm Victor. As always, this story has been assembled by our editorial team from several different sources, and I invite you to listen with an open mind. If you believe, leave the comment, "I believe," below. Without waiting any longer, let's go back to that morning, when Walt Pruitt was still casting his line into a quiet creek. Morning on Bear Basin began beneath a thin layer of fog resting low over the water, pale as the last breath of the night. Early light filtered through towering Douglas firs, breaking into blue-gray streaks across the creek before disappearing between moss-covered stones. The current wasn't strong, just enough to produce a steady, soft, cold sound as it slipped through the shallow stretches and gathered into tea-colored pools. There were no cars, no chainsaws, no cell service. Out there, the modern world seemed to stop several hours of walking behind you. That was exactly why Walt Pruitt loved Bear Basin. For more than 20 years, he had returned to the same network of creeks near the California and Oregon border, at first 2 or 3 times a year, and later only for one longer trip near the end of the season. He knew the deep pools, the submerged logs, and the places where rainbow trout usually held behind large rocks to stay out of the current. He also knew which stretches looked beautiful but almost never held fish. Walt stepped into the water wearing old waders faded around the knees. At 61, he didn't move through a creek as quickly as he once had, but his feet still knew how to test slick rocks better than those of most younger men. He rested his wading staff against one shoulder, kept the rod low to avoid catching the line in branches, and moved toward a pool. He had jokingly called Bear Basin's money pocket because he had never left it empty-handed if he stayed patient long enough. 3 years earlier, his wife had still been sitting on a rock, not far from there, reading while he cast. She hadn't liked fishing, but she had loved the trips. After she died, Walt's house became too quiet in the evenings. He didn't try to fill that silence with television or visitors. He went back to the woods. The emptiness was still there on those solo trips, but at least in Bear Basin, silence didn't feel like a room missing someone. He chose a dark artificial fly, reteed the knot, and cast toward the edge of the current. The fly landed exactly where he wanted it. Walt waited, retrieved the line, and cast again. Nothing. He shifted his position, tried a brighter pattern, then moved nearly 60 feet farther toward the opposite bank. After 40 minutes, he still hadn't seen a strike. That was unusual enough to make him start watching the water instead of his fly line. No shadows moved across the rocks. No flashes of silver appeared beneath the light. The quiet pockets behind the larger stones were empty. Walt tried 3 more places. More than an hour passed without the line tightening once. But the water was clear that day, the flow was steady, and the weather wasn't unusual. What bothered Walt was the complete absence of life. The fish weren't simply refusing to bite. He couldn't see them at all. He crouched near the bank, checked the rocks, turned over several smaller stones, and found fewer aquatic insects than he normally would. A shrub beside the water had several yellowing leaves even though it wasn't yet the season for them to change. None of those details meant much by themselves, but together they made Bear Basin feel like a house where all the furniture was still in place, but everyone who lived there had gone. Walt stood in the middle of the creek with cold water pressing against his shins, and looked downstream where the channel curved into the forest. He rarely went much farther because the terrain narrowed, the boulders grew larger, and there wasn't much room to cast. That morning, the strange condition of the water made him more curious than disappointed. He tucked his fly box into his chest pocket, tightened the shoulder strap, and started moving downstream. The water deepened in several places, forcing him to slow down. Ferns crowded both banks beneath Douglas firs and cedars. The fog still hadn't fully lifted, making the gaps between the trees look like long hallways with no visible end. After nearly half an hour, Walt reached a bend, hidden behind two shoulder-high boulders. The current slowed there and opened into a broad pool before narrowing through a rocky channel farther below. Walt immediately thought there had to be fish here. Deep water, good shade, and a current gentle enough for trout to hold position without wasting energy. He stepped past the first boulder and searched for rings on the surface or shadows moving below. Still nothing. He was preparing to make a cast when he noticed a large shape ahead, where the gravel bar stretched toward the right bank. At first, Walt thought it was a log that had washed down during high water. The object was long and dark, caught between two rocks, with one section projecting toward the creek. He had seen plenty of flood debris collect like that after winter, but as he moved several steps closer, the shape began losing the random geometry of wood. One end was more rounded. The middle widened, narrowed, then spread outward on both sides like shoulders. Walt stopped. His second thought was a large bear. Bears died in the wilderness, and water could move a carcass into strange positions. He had once seen a dead black bear beside a road many years earlier, but even that memory didn't form lying in front of him. Walt moved another 15 feet and stopped completely. The body was covered from head to foot in gray-brown hair. It lay face down with the upper torso resting across the gravel, one arm extended toward the water. That arm was what made Walt stop calling it a bear in his own mind. The shoulder, elbow, and wrist formed a line that looked far too human. The hand near the water had long, clearly separated fingers. The legs didn't match a bear's proportions either. If the body had been stretched out fully, it would have been taller than any man Walt had ever met. He stood still long enough for the tips of his fingers to become cold inside his gloves. The body didn't move. There was no breathing, no response to the water or the sound of Walt's steps. He looked around the forest before looking back at the body, a reaction he didn't fully understand himself. If something like this was lying there, his first thought wasn't only what it was. He also wondered whether anything else might still be nearby. Walt took his phone from a waterproof pocket. The screen showed no service, exactly as he expected. Instead of trying to call, he opened the camera. His hand shook enough to blur the first picture. He took another from the same position, then stepped to a different angle so one of the large rocks could provide a scale reference. He didn't move closer. More than 20 years in the woods had taught him that when he found something he didn't understand, stepping closer was rarely the smartest first move. Walt enlarged one of the photographs. On the small screen, the shape looked even harder to accept than it did with the naked eye. Broad shoulders, a long back, an arm nearly touching the creek. Thick hair covered the body, but didn't hide the underlying structure. Walt began thinking about Bigfoot only because he couldn't find another name that came close. He had never been someone who followed Sasquatch stories. Living in the Northwest, he knew the folklore and had heard people talk about footprints, strange howls, and large figures crossing roads. Walt had always placed those stories in the same category as hunting tales that grew larger with every beer. But hearing a story in a diner was nothing like standing in front of a body. He didn't feel excited. He felt like he had stepped into a place where he didn't belong. He considered staying. If he left, scavengers or rising water could alter the scene. But remaining alone without communication, hours from the nearest ranger station, and without knowing what had killed the animal was also a bad decision. Walt chose the same approach he had relied on throughout his career as a mechanic whenever he faced an unfamiliar mechanical failure. Don't touch what you don't understand, document the condition, and find someone with the right expertise. He took an orange strip of cloth from his small field kit and tied it to a branch far enough away that he wouldn't disturb the site, then recorded the relative location in his offline map application. Before leaving, Walt looked back one more time. One arm still pointed toward the creek, the fingertips only a few inches from the water. The image made the death feel different from an ordinary accident. It looked as though the Sasquatch had tried to crawl toward the stream before collapsing. Walt didn't know why that thought came to him, but it stayed with him for the entire walk back upstream. The return trip felt much longer than the walk-in. Walt stopped noticing the forest. He thought only about the photographs on his phone and tried to arrange them into an explanation he could say out loud without making the listener think he had lost his mind. When he reached the main trail, he checked the phone several times, but still had no signal. He kept walking until nearly noon, when his knees began to ache and his shoulders stiffened under the weight of his gear. Finally, one bar appeared and disappeared. Walt ignored the urge to call and kept going toward the nearest ranger station because he knew describing the scene over a phone line would mean far less than putting the photographs in front of someone responsible. Miguel Torres was checking patrol logs when Walt entered the station. He recognized the fisherman because Walt had registered routes in the area for years. Walt put his hat on the table, drank most of a bottle of water, then started from the beginning. Miguel listened with the calm expression of someone who had handled every kind of strange report wilderness visitors could bring in. In his experience, a large animal dead beside a creek usually turned out to be a bear, elk, or something altered by disease, and several days of decomposition. Even when Walt described the hand and the body length, Miguel's expression didn't change. Then Walt handed him the phone. Miguel looked at the first photograph, enlarged it, moved to the second, then returned to the first. He set the phone down for several seconds before picking it up again. The skepticism in his face shifted into concentration. Miguel asked whether Walt had touched the body, whether he had seen other tracks, whether the water smelled unusual, and whether there had been any sign of campers or hunters nearby. Walt answered each question. He hadn't touched anything. He hadn't seen anyone. There was no smell of gasoline or smoke, only the strange absence of fish. Miguel crossed to another desk, picked up the landline, and called a contact with the State Wildlife Forensic Unit. He didn't use the word Bigfoot. He described a large, unidentified animal whose morphology didn't match a bear, lying near Bear Basin Creek, with the scene apparently undisturbed. After several minutes, the call was transferred to Dr. Naomi Reyes. Naomi was in a laboratory several hours away, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary workday. She was 44, specialized in wildlife forensic pathology, and had spent more than 20 years investigating unusual deaths involving large animals, including deer, cougars, and bears. Reports about mysterious animals rarely excited her. Bad camera angles, decomposition, wet fur, or trauma could make familiar wildlife look very different. Miguel described the body proportions from Walt's photographs. Nearly 10 feet long, broad shoulders, long arms, a hand with clearly defined fingers, and limb positioning that didn't match a bear. Naomi asked about the skull, feet, tail, and the placement of the shoulder bones. Miguel answered within the limits of what the photographs showed. After several minutes, Naomi stopped taking notes automatically and began listening more carefully. The size wasn't what interested her. Witness reports often exaggerated size. The relationship between the arms, torso, and legs was what didn't fit. If it were a bear lying face down, the shoulder joint position and forelimb structure should have looked different. If it were a person in some kind of fur suit, the width of the back and the length of the forearms created another problem. Naomi didn't offer a conclusion. She told Miguel to preserve the scene, keep unnecessary personnel away, and be ready to guide her in. She decided to leave that same day. Before departing the laboratory, Naomi packed a field kit with a forensic camera, measuring tools, tissue sampling equipment, preservation vials, water test strips, gloves, evidence bags, and preliminary testing equipment. She also opened the database of unusual large animal deaths in the Klamath-Siskiyou region to see whether Bear Basin had ever produced a similar event. It was simply a background check she routinely performed before going into the field. Naomi filtered the previous 5 years, selected cases where the cause of death or species had remained uncertain, then narrowed the radius around the creek system. A short list appeared. She was about to close the window when she noticed that the coordinates were unusually close together. Naomi opened the map. 7 cases appeared along the same water system. She checked them one at a time. The reports had been filed at different times by different teams. Several were labeled unidentified large animal due to insufficient sample condition. 2 had been provisionally classified as bears, but lacked complete morphological evidence. 1 case had left only hair and tissue samples that produced no confirmed identification. None of the reports was remarkable enough to attract attention on its own. Placed on the same map, they looked different. All 7 cases fell within a 15-mile radius of the location Walt had just reported. Every one of them sat along tributaries feeding the same creek system. Naomi stared at the screen longer than she had intended. The call from Bear Basin had stopped being one strange, isolated report. It had become a pattern. Naomi reached the Bear Basin Ranger Station late that morning, after nearly 3 hours of driving narrow mountain roads and then hiking a long distance from the point where her vehicle could go no farther. Miguel Torres was waiting for her on the porch with his backpack already on, while Walt Pruitt stood beside an old wooden table, looking like a man who had never really left that bend in the creek in his mind. Naomi didn't begin by asking Walt what he thought the body was. She simply told him to lead them back, exactly the way he had gone that morning, follow the same route, and touch nothing near the scene. Walt nodded. The 3 of them left the station under a weight that hadn't been there the first time he had walked that trail. Walt went first. Miguel stayed in the rear to watch behind them, while Naomi moved in the middle, recording the weather, temperature, humidity, direction of stream flow, and any environmental changes that might affect the scene. After more than 2 hours, the strip of orange cloth Walt had tied to a branch appeared among the ferns. Walt stopped, pointed toward the bend, then stepped back. Naomi moved forward alone for several yards and studied the overall scene before allowing anyone else closer. She placed simple markers with flagging tape, photographed the area from 4 directions, and recorded the distances from the body to the water line, the large boulder, and the bank. Only after the entire scene had been documented did Naomi put on gloves and enter the inner area. The body lay exactly as it had in Walt's photographs, but its size in person made Naomi stop for several seconds. She didn't allow surprise to replace procedure. She began with external characteristics: total body length, shoulder width, arm-to-torso ratio, foot position, and spinal angle. The hand was the first thing that made her abandon the bear hypothesis. The fingers were clearly separated, and the thumb opposed the others in a way adapted for grasping. The wrist was flexible and didn't resemble the four-limb structure of a bear. The skull extended backward along the spinal axis in a way more consistent with a body that regularly carried the head above an upright torso. Naomi didn't say the word Sasquatch. She only wrote large unidentified mammal, morphological characteristics inconsistent with known regional species. She continued examining areas that might show trauma from a fall, impact, or predation. There were no obvious bite wounds, no external fractures, no drag marks, or major disturbance across the gravel bar. The position of the body didn't suggest a fall from higher ground either. The skin and hair lacked the mechanical injuries Naomi normally saw in vehicle strikes or territorial fights. She used a tissue thermometer, checked rigor, examined the surface of the eyes, and what mucous membranes remained visible. Each detail pushed her farther away from trauma as the cause of death. Miguel remained outside the inner perimeter, his back turned toward Naomi more often than toward the body. His eyes kept moving through the openings between the trees, down toward the creek, and back up the slope. Naomi noticed but didn't ask. An unidentified animal lying dead in remote wilderness was enough to make any ranger consider the possibility that others of the same kind might still be nearby. Walt stayed farther back near the place where he had stopped the day before. He didn't stare continuously at the body. Every so often he turned toward the water, where not a single fish broke the surface. Naomi collected hair samples from 3 locations, took a small liver tissue sample through the least invasive approach available, then gathered soil and water samples immediately beside the body. When she leaned close to the head, she noticed that the hair around the mouth was much lighter than the hair along the neck and shoulders. At first she thought it might be water exposure or age, but the same pale coloring appeared around the feet. The change didn't form bald patches. It looked more like pigment loss or alteration caused by long-term exposure. She photographed the areas in close detail, marked their locations, then examined the nails and foot pads. There were no signs of an acute chemical burn, but the parts of the body that had the most direct contact with water and soil were visibly different in color. Her field kit couldn't provide a complete answer, but Naomi ran several preliminary tests on the tissue and water samples. The results weren't enough for a conclusion, only enough to show that several values fell outside the range she expected. She sealed each sample separately, labeled it, and recorded the time and coordinates. Before finishing, Naomi returned to the hand one more time. The skeletal structure beneath the tissue, the opposing thumb, and the length of the forearm formed a combination that was too distinct to dismiss. She had examined hundreds of large mammals. Nothing in her reference knowledge matched the body in front of her. As Naomi stood to leave the inner area, her eyes caught a depression in the mud about 20 feet from the body. At first, she thought it was one of Walt's old boot prints. When she moved closer, the shape was completely different. The impression was long and broad, with the front widening into 5 faint toe marks. More importantly, it was significantly smaller than the foot of the dead individual. Naomi crouched, placed a ruler beside the print, photographed it, then looked upstream. Several yards away was a second impression, fainter but pointing in the same direction. She called Miguel over. Together they expanded the search area and moved slowly along the bank 1 yard at a time so they wouldn't destroy the tracks. Walt was told to remain where he was. The trail appeared intermittently, in the mud, disappeared across the gravel, then returned near damp grass. Naomi measured the stride. In some places, the left and right prints were evenly spaced, but farther upstream the rhythm became increasingly unstable. One foot sank much deeper than the other in several spots, with a faint drag mark beside it. Another section showed where the individual had leaned or collapsed to one side, crushing an entire patch of ferns. That changed the meaning of the scene completely. If the tracks belonged to the same species, a second individual had still been alive when it passed through, and the way it moved suggested it wasn't healthy. Naomi didn't know the relationship between the two individuals or exactly how fresh the tracks were, but the sharpness of the edges and the amount of water that had not yet filled the impressions suggested they weren't old. Miguel stared upstream for a long time. Quietly, he said that terrain led into an area with very few patrol routes, where the forest became much denser and steeper. Naomi kept surveying. Along the bank, several clusters of low vegetation had brown, curled edges, even though the rest of the forest was still green. A patch of grass beside standing water had turned completely yellow in a crescent shape. She clipped several leaf samples and sealed them in bags. Miguel crouched near the creek and commented that the water level looked lower than he remembered for that time of year. He had noted similar conditions in dry season reports before, but Bear Basin had many small tributaries and changed quickly with rainfall, so nobody had ever treated the lower flow as a meaningful sign by itself. That was when Walt finally spoke up. In more than 20 years, he had never seen that stretch of Bear Basin without fish the way it had been that morning. Some years the water ran lower, some years floods rearranged the creek bed, but the fish were always there. That morning he had spent nearly an hour trying spots where he knew there should have been trout and hadn't seen a single one. Walt's observation wasn't laboratory data, but to Naomi it had value because it stretched across time. Someone who returned to the same creek for 2 decades could often notice a change before formal data even existed. Naomi collected a water sample at the scene, then took 3 more at intervals moving upstream. She measured pH, conductivity, and several rapid response indicators. None of the individual values looked extreme on its own, but they all shifted in the same direction. The most noticeable change was how the readings increased as they moved farther upstream. The 4th sample, taken near the place where the tracks became most unsteady, showed conductivity significantly higher than the downstream sample. Naomi marked the location on the Global Positioning System unit. She wanted to keep going, but the light had already begun to change. The Siskiyou country went dark quickly once the sun dropped behind the ridges, and tracking through dense forest wasn't something they should continue when they still didn't know whether they were following a weakened animal or moving closer to whatever had weakened it. Miguel suggested turning back before they lost daylight completely. Naomi reluctantly agreed. They collected their equipment, marked the last track location, and started back. The return to the station felt different. They had gone to Bear Basin to investigate a death. Now, Naomi knew that at least one other individual had left the scene in an unstable condition. She also knew the environment along the creek was showing signs consistent with some kind of exposure. Those 2 facts forced the investigation to shift from what happened to what is happening. By the time the 3 of them reached the station, it was dark. Naomi set up the portable analyzer on a metal table in the side room. Miguel made coffee but left his cup untouched near the window. Walt sat at the far end of the room, silently watching her process the samples. Naomi started with the liver tissue, then tested the water and compared the results with baseline values available in the regional database. The machine worked slowly because field equipment had limits, but it was enough to screen broad groups of substances. The first result that appeared made Naomi stop with her hands over the keyboard. Several heavy metals were many times higher than normal biological levels. At the same time, the tissue response spectrum showed traces of an agricultural compound that shouldn't have been present at that concentration in wildlife from this area. Naomi reran the control, replaced the cartridge, and repeated the analysis. The results barely changed. Miguel stood beside her, when the second dataset appeared. Naomi didn't speak immediately. She opened the toxicology database, entered the spectral code, and waited for the system to compare it. The compound came back as part of a highly potent rodenticide group that had been severely restricted and banned from outdoor use for years because of its ability to poison non-target species through water, food, and the predator chain. Miguel didn't look as surprised as Walt. He read the chemical name and sat down. During years of patrolling national forest land, he had seen similar chemical packages at abandoned illegal marijuana grows. Deep forest operations often diverted creek water, used concentrated fertilizers, and applied rodenticides to protect the crop. Without oversight, residue soaked into the soil or ran back into waterways. A dose small enough not to kill immediately could still accumulate in tissue over prolonged exposure. Naomi spread a Klamath Siskiyou topographic map across the table. She marked the location of the body Walt had found, then reopened the 7 older cases she had reviewed before leaving the laboratory. One coordinate after another went onto the map. By the time the 7th point appeared, a line almost formed by itself. Every case sat along tributaries feeding Bear Basin, and the more recent the year, the closer the locations moved toward the headwaters. She opened publicly available satellite imagery and selected seasonal layers from the current year and the previous 2. Most of the forest looked uniform: dense canopy, dark green vegetation, creek channels almost completely hidden beneath the trees. But near one headwater area, several miles beyond the normal patrol routes, the vegetation showed an unusual geometric change. A lighter green strip formed a line too straight to be a natural opening. Beside it were narrow traces that looked like piping or trails partially concealed beneath the canopy. Miguel leaned closer to the screen. He knew the area. There were no legal campsites there, no active logging roads, and no water diversion permits. If an operation large enough to alter the vegetation was taking place, it was happening outside the system. Naomi looked back at the test results. The body, the missing fish, the dying vegetation beside the creek, the lower water level, the heavy metals, the rodenticide, the 7 previous cases, and the second set of tracks all pointed toward the same place. This was no longer a chain of coincidences. Miguel used the radio and satellite phone to contact the federal patrol team responsible for illegal grow sites. The response came almost 20 minutes later. They were already dealing with 2 separate operations. Their personnel were spread thin, and the earliest they could send a team to Bear Basin would be several days. They instructed Miguel to preserve the evidence, avoid approaching the suspected site, and submit the coordinates through official channels. Naomi listened to all of it, but she couldn't separate that advice from the trail of footprints in her mind. If the second individual was suffering from the same exposure, it had already begun losing its balance. The tissue from the dead individual showed severe contamination. Several days might be reasonable for procedure, but not for a body that was already failing. She marked the final track location on the map. It sat between the death scene and the suspected headwater site. If the individual continued moving in that direction, it might be heading closer to the contamination source instead of away from it. Naomi knew that going upstream the next morning would take them beyond the boundaries of a normal forensic investigation. She had no authority to arrest illegal growers, and Miguel didn't have enough personnel to conduct an enforcement operation. The only justification for moving forward was to locate the surviving individual, assess its condition, and get it away from the suspected water source. They would document evidence, avoid contact with anyone in the area, and turn back the moment the risk exceeded what they could control. But both of them understood how fragile those rules could become once the forest closed in around them. Walt left the station after giving his full statement, leaving Naomi and Miguel alone in front of a map covered with red marks. The only sound in the room came from the analyzer's cooling fan. Naomi gathered the results, arranged them in chronological order, then looked again at the creek system. The headwaters were no longer blank space on a map. They were the likely location of a contamination source, and a living being that was getting weaker. She folded the map and looked at Miguel. If we wait for the federal team, that animal will be dead before they finish the paperwork. Miguel stayed silent for a long time. Then he reached for his jacket. Naomi left the ranger station before the sun was fully up, her backpack heavier than the day before with the water testing kit, first aid supplies, camera, spare batteries, and a veterinary tranquilizer rifle she had borrowed from a colleague before leaving. Miguel walked beside her, while Walt was already waiting at the trail, as though he had never really left Bear Basin during the night. Nobody tried to convince Walt to stay behind. He only said he was the one who found the body, and needed to know what had happened to the creek that had been part of his life for more than 20 years. Naomi agreed to let him guide them as far as the last point he still knew well, on the condition that he stop there. Walt didn't argue. He only tightened the straps on his backpack and started down the trail, still wet with morning mist. The morning was colder than the day before. Bear Basin ran low between its banks, exposing dark bands of mud and moss-covered gravel. The farther upstream they went, the more obvious the changes became, compared with the area around the body. Grasses near the water had yellowed tips. Several patches of ferns drooped even though the soil was still damp. In slower sections of the creek, a thin film appeared on the surface and changed color when sunlight broke through the canopy. Naomi knelt to collect samples, marked the coordinates, then ran quick pH and conductivity tests. None of the readings jumped to an extreme level, but the upward trend toward the headwaters continued. That kind of pattern worried her more than one dramatic number, because it suggested an ongoing contamination source rather than an isolated spill that had ended long ago. Walt moved slowly but steadily. He knew where every fallen trunk lay, where the banks were likely to give way, and where the creek split into two narrow channels before joining again farther upstream. Sometimes he stopped without warning, stared at the water for a long time, then continued walking. Naomi knew he was comparing what he saw with memory. A person didn't need a degree in ecology to recognize that a place visited for 20 years had changed. The silence of the creek made even Miguel speak less than usual. They saw no fish breaking the surface, no wading birds feeding along the shallows, and even the insects above the water were unusually scarce. Near mid-morning, Naomi found a fresh footprint. It sat on a narrow strip of mud beside a leaning cedar and was far sharper than the track sequence they had found the day before. 5 toe impressions were clearly visible. The heel was deep, and the overall length matched the second individual. Naomi placed a ruler beside it and examined the edge of the mud. No fresh leaves had fallen across it, and water hadn't yet softened the outline. She estimated that the print had been made less than 24 hours earlier. Several yards away was a second print, then a third. The trail continued upstream. The initial hope quickly turned into concern as they followed it for another few dozen yards. The stride was uneven. Some steps were long, others unusually short. One left footprint sank much deeper than the right. In several places, the edge of the mud showed a faint drag where the individual appeared to have lost balance and recovered. A small shrub had been pushed sideways at nearly shoulder height, suggesting the Sasquatch had leaned against it for support. Naomi stopped viewing the tracks as simple, investigative evidence. They looked more like a survival record, written directly into the ground. Miguel unshouldered the tranquilizer rifle and checked the mechanism. His hands shook slightly as he locked the dart chamber back into place. Naomi had calculated a dose using the estimated mass of the dead individual, but both of them understood that the number was only an approximation. There was no dosage chart for an undescribed species. Too little would do nothing. Too much could be dangerous to an already poisoned body. The rifle was only a last resort if the surviving Sasquatch panicked or became a danger to himself. Miguel slung it back over his shoulder, but his expression didn't relax. Near noon, Walt stopped in front of a dense wall of vegetation wedged between two rocky slopes. Alder trunks and thorny brush blocked the view, with unfamiliar country rising beyond them. This was the farthest Walt had ever traveled up Bear Basin. He pointed ahead and admitted he didn't know the route from there. There was no fishing trail, no old marker, and nowhere anyone he knew had ever mentioned going. Naomi checked the Global Positioning System unit. The suspicious area from the satellite imagery was still several miles farther in. Walt wanted to continue, but Naomi refused. They needed someone to remain at a point where he could return more quickly if communication failed. Walt reluctantly agreed to stay at the landmark and attempt radio contact at regular intervals. Miguel left him spare batteries and established check-in times. When Naomi and Miguel began forcing their way through the dense vegetation, Walt remained in the small opening beside the creek. He looked far more alone than he had while guiding them, but his eyes followed until both disappeared behind the trees. Only a few minutes after crossing the vegetation line, Naomi noticed the first smell. It wasn't tree resin, wet soil, or animal waste. It was a sharp chemical odor, slightly sweet at first and bitter afterward, strong enough to dry the back of her throat. Miguel stopped too. Neither of them needed to say anything. They pulled cloth over their noses, lowered their bodies, and moved more slowly. The odor became stronger as the ground began to rise. Signs of human activity appeared beneath their feet. A length of black plastic tubing, almost completely hidden beneath leaves, ran along the slope. Blue plastic cord had been tied around the base of a tree. Farther on, a fresh boot print appeared in the mud. Miguel pointed toward a narrow water trench that had been dug away from the natural stream course. Naomi photographed each sign without touching it. There was no longer any doubt that people were operating there. They climbed onto a higher patch of ground, then crawled the last stretch on their elbows so their silhouettes wouldn't rise above the cover. From that position, the entire area below opened into view. A large section of forest had been cleared and hidden beneath layers of green camouflage netting. From above, it almost disappeared into the canopy, but from Naomi's lower angle, she could see hundreds of cultivated plants arranged in rows. Black tubing ran everywhere, carrying water from a dammed tributary into storage tanks, and then down through the planting beds. Several plastic drums stood near the edge of the site beside fertilizer bags and smaller, unmarked containers. A pump vibrated steadily beneath a makeshift cover. Naomi raised the binoculars. Near one corner beside the creek, dark liquid streaked down the sides of two drums, soaked into the ground, then collected in a shallow trench that led back toward the water. The grass around it had died in patches. She took several photographs through the zoom lens, trying to capture the containers, the drainage channel, and their relationship to the stream in the same frame. What they had suspected the night before was now visible as a complete system. Water was being diverted from Bear Basin, used by the grow operation, exposed to chemicals, then discharged back into the environment. Miguel watched the people below. 4 men were moving between the rows. One wore a dark baseball cap and a brown jacket and walked with a slight limp. Miguel recognized him before he could clearly see the face. Silas Krantz had appeared years earlier in a case involving unauthorized use of public land and illegal transport of supplies. The case had been minor, the evidence weak, and no prosecution followed. But Miguel remembered the name because Krantz had been mentioned more than once around deep forest growing operations. Naomi cared less about who Krantz was than what he was allowing to enter the water. She watched the chemical containers, the hoses patched with tape, the dark drainage channels, and the dead vegetation. The 7 deaths over 5 years were no longer old case files. They were possible consequences of an operation that had existed long enough to poison an entire watershed. Movement at the edge of the camp made Naomi lower the binoculars and raise them again. At first, she thought a tree trunk had shifted in the wind, but the dark shape changed position. Between 2 firs, less than 100 yards from the grow site, a very large figure stood partly hidden in shadow. It was taller than a human, broad-shouldered, and covered in dark hair. The Sasquatch didn't move toward the camp. He simply stood there with one hand gripping a tree trunk, as though he needed it for balance. Naomi touched Miguel's arm and signaled for absolute silence. He followed her line of sight and went rigid. Both of them pressed closer to the ground. Through the binoculars, Naomi watched the Sasquatch shift his weight very slowly from one leg to the other. One shoulder hung lower. He appeared to be watching the men below, but his posture wasn't predatory. At times, his head dropped as if he were exhausted. Naomi wanted to move toward him immediately, but the path between them and the Sasquatch crossed an area visible from the camp. One wrong movement could end both the investigation and any chance of rescue. She forced herself to stay still, took more photographs of the site, and recorded the coordinates. A dog barked below. A guard dog tied near one of the temporary structures lunged against its leash, turned toward the slope, and barked rapidly. A second dog answered immediately. The men in the camp stopped working. Krantz raised his head and looked toward the trees. Naomi and Miguel backed away from the overlook at once. They didn't run straight downhill. First, they crawled backward for nearly 60 feet, using thick vegetation to hide their movement, then rose into a low crouch and began moving. The dogs kept barking behind them. Voices called to one another, followed by the sound of metal striking the side of a vehicle. Miguel chose a route around a rocky slope to avoid leaving clear footprints in the mud. They moved quickly, but under control. Naomi held the camera against her chest, protecting the memory card more carefully than the camera itself. If they were discovered, the photographs of the chemical drums, the tubing, and the contaminated runoff were the most important evidence they possessed. Miguel kept looking back and listening to the direction of the sounds. Nobody was following immediately, but the dogs had clearly alerted the camp to activity on the slope. About half a mile from the camp, Naomi saw the Sasquatch again. He stood in a more open section of forest to their left, about 200 feet away. This time there was no dense canopy hiding him. The large body was covered in gray-brown hair, but several areas around the mouth, hands, and lower arms were unusually pale, exactly like the pigment changes Naomi had documented on the dead Sasquatch. One leg remained slightly bent. He leaned one shoulder against a cedar and breathed heavily enough that Naomi could see his chest rising and falling from that distance. She stopped. Miguel reached to pull her forward, but Naomi raised one hand. The Sasquatch looked at them. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for Naomi to see that his eyes were fully alert. He didn't growl, flee immediately, or approach. His head tilted slightly, as if assessing the 2 humans in front of him. Naomi lowered herself a little to reduce the threat of her posture. She didn't reach for the tranquilizer rifle. The Sasquatch released the tree and started walking. The first step was steady. The second veered sharply to the side. He had to brace one hand against another trunk to keep from falling. Naomi felt the urgency increase with every movement. If the pale hair represented the same long-term exposure seen in the dead individual, the condition had already advanced significantly. The loss of coordination suggested neurological involvement or broader systemic failure. Miguel took out the Global Positioning System unit and recorded the exact coordinates. The Sasquatch continued deeper into the forest, but he wasn't moving quickly. He stopped one more time, looked back, then disappeared behind a strip of lower trees. Naomi wanted to follow. Every professional instinct told her to reach him and evaluate his condition before it was too late. But the dogs were still barking behind them, and the camp was too close. If they led Krantz's people directly to the Sasquatch, the result could be worse than temporarily withdrawing. They made a wide loop to the south and chose a return route toward Walt that didn't retrace their original path. As they moved, Naomi built a plan in her head. They needed to return with intravenous fluids, warming materials, and some way to move the Sasquatch if necessary. The tranquilizer might not be needed if he was already too weak. Most importantly, they had to approach from another direction, avoid the camp, and stay away from contaminated water. Miguel said there was an eastern rock cut that might circle toward the coordinates they had just recorded, though he had never traveled the entire route. Naomi looked toward the place where the Sasquatch had disappeared and realized they were being pulled between two dangers. On one side were people with every reason to hide the camp. On the other was a living Sasquatch, growing weaker by the hour, and possibly no longer strong enough to leave the contaminated area. Naomi had never faced a situation where the subject needing rescue was also living evidence of the case itself. If Krantz saw him first, he might treat the Sasquatch as a threat, evidence, or something worth hunting. That thought made withdrawal feel like more than a matter of protecting themselves. As they approached the area where Walt was waiting, Miguel's radio began catching intermittent static. He tried calling. Walt answered after 2 attempts, his voice tense but clear. He was still in position and hadn't seen anyone else. Naomi felt some of the pressure ease. They were about 40 minutes away. Then an engine sounded behind them. It wasn't the pump. A pickup truck was revving at the camp. The sound increased quickly, disappeared behind the terrain, then returned from a higher direction. Miguel stopped immediately. An old dirt road apparently curved around the slope, one that hadn't shown clearly in the satellite imagery. If Krantz could use a vehicle on it, his men could reach the withdrawal route much faster than Naomi and Miguel had expected. A beam of light swept between the trees behind them. Then another higher up. Naomi and Miguel dropped into the low vegetation. Headlights moved across the hillside, where they had been standing only minutes before, turning the fir trunks white before disappearing around another bend. The engine continued getting closer. Krantz had sent people to investigate whatever had made the dogs bark. Naomi and Miguel moved away from the ridge the moment the headlights swept across the trees behind them. They didn't run straight downhill. Instead, they cut diagonally across the slope using large fir trunks and dense alderbrush to hide their movement. The ground dropped sharply, with wet rocks buried beneath rotting leaves, and every step carried the risk of sliding into the dark drainage below. The pickup sounded close, then distant, but its headlights appeared more clearly between the trees each time, confirming that Krantz's people were using an old road running parallel to their retreat. The memory card held photographs of the chemical drums, the water diversion system, and the drainage trenches feeding back into Bear Basin. If they lost it, the strongest direct evidence in the investigation could disappear along with their chance to prove what was happening at the headwaters. Miguel knew how to move through this forest, but even he had to slow down as darkness settled quickly beneath the canopy. A long moment of quiet followed, then 2 vehicle doors slammed. Miguel tilted his head and listened. He could make out at least 2 voices. A flashlight beam moved low through the forest and paused on brush that Naomi and Miguel had pushed aside. The men had left the truck and were beginning to track them. Miguel pulled Naomi behind a moss-covered fallen tree, where the space underneath was deep enough for both of them to stay low. From there, they heard footsteps approaching. One of the men behind them carried a hunting rifle. The faint metallic contact against a sling buckle was familiar enough for Miguel to recognize. Their voices didn't sound like legitimate growers who had accidentally encountered lost hikers. They were looking for someone, and the way they called to one another suggested they believed whoever was on the slope had seen something they weren't supposed to see. Miguel touched the chest pocket where his Federal Ranger identification was stored. Very quietly, he told Naomi that if they were exposed, they would stand up and identify themselves immediately. Legally, he had the authority to question them about unauthorized occupation of public land, water diversion, and suspected prohibited chemicals. But both Naomi and Miguel understood that authority didn't create an invisible wall around them. In a place several hours from the nearest patrol route, the law only carried weight if the people facing it believed consequences would actually follow their actions. A flashlight beam stopped at the edge of the mud less than 60 feet from them. The man called to the other one and pointed down. Naomi and Miguel's boot prints were clear in the damp ground. The beam immediately followed the trail and moved directly toward the fallen tree. Miguel stood first, raising one hand high while pulling his identification from his pocket with the other. His voice carried clearly through the forest as he identified himself as a Federal Ranger performing official duties. Naomi rose behind him and kept both hands where the men could see them. One man in a black rain jacket held a hunting rifle pointed downward but didn't release his grip on the stock. The other held the flashlight and kept looking between Miguel's credentials and the camera in Naomi's hand. Miguel ordered them to keep the weapon lowered and explain why they were on Federal land. The man asked what they were doing on the slope and what they had photographed. That question told Naomi enough. The men understood that the real danger wasn't the two strangers. It was whatever evidence might already have been collected. Miguel repeated his authority and ordered them to maintain their distance. The man with the flash looked at his partner, then gave a long whistle. Less than a minute later, two more lights appeared farther back. Footsteps and breaking branches approached from the direction of the grow site. Naomi understood that their only real advantage was that Krantz and his men had no idea whether the evidence had already been copied or transmitted. If they believed people outside the forest knew the location, they would have to think carefully before escalating to violence. Silas Krantz stepped out of the darkness, wearing the brown jacket and dark cap Naomi had seen through the binoculars. Krantz looked at Miguel's identification first, then at Naomi. His face showed little surprise, only the cold concentration of a man calculating how dangerous the situation had become for him. Nobody unloaded a weapon or set one down, but the lack of sudden movement reduced the tension slightly during the first few seconds. Krantz said the area was dangerous, that private agricultural work was taking place nearby, and that Naomi and Miguel might have wandered somewhere they shouldn't be. Miguel replied that the ground beneath them was national forest land, and no valid cultivation permit had been registered for those coordinates. He mentioned water diversion, an illegal piping system, and evidence of prohibited chemical use. Krantz kept his voice calm and claimed that some people leasing land nearby might have done things he didn't control. Miguel stated only what could be verified. Water had been diverted. Vegetation had been cleared. Chemical containers were sitting beside a tributary, and a drainage trench led directly back into the Bear Basin system. When he mentioned federal statutes covering unauthorized use of public land and water contamination, Krantz's expression changed. He still looked controlled, but his eyes began moving toward Naomi's camera more often. Naomi didn't want the confrontation to turn into a legal argument when she wasn't the primary enforcement officer. But when Krantz denied that any wildlife had been affected, she moved half a step forward. She told him briefly that they already had water samples, tissue samples, and a pattern of animal deaths stretching across several years along the same watershed. Chemicals identified in the tissue matched the same category now present near the camp. She didn't mention Sasquatch and didn't reveal the surviving individual. Simply hearing the phrase, "several years," made Krantz hesitate. He asked what species the dead animals were. The question came too quickly from someone who had just claimed to know nothing. Naomi didn't answer. Miguel immediately stepped in and said all evidence would be forwarded to the federal agency responsible for environmental crimes. Krantz could allow them to leave safely and respond through the proper process, or he could detain them and turn an environmental violation into a much larger multi-agency response. For the first time, the silence belonged to Krantz. He looked at each of his men, then toward the slope where the truck was parked. Naomi realized he was calculating consequences, not morality. If a federal ranger and a wildlife forensic specialist disappeared in an area where they had filed their route, the camp wouldn't have many days left. Krantz finally raised one hand and signaled his men to step back. He didn't apologize or admit anything. He only said they could leave, but the country ahead was dangerous, and they'd be better off not coming back. Miguel didn't answer the warning. He motioned for Naomi to move first while he kept facing Krantz's group for the first several dozen steps. Only after the flashlight beams behind them became smaller did they increase their pace toward the rendezvous point with Walt. Naomi knew they had won the right to leave, but they had also told Krantz that his camp had been discovered. From that moment on, he could move chemicals, destroy evidence, reroute pipes, or post people along the approaches. The window to return for the surviving Sasquatch was closing quickly. The radio at Miguel's side crackled as they descended near a rocky cut. The signal was so weak that the first sentence broke apart. Miguel stopped, raised the radio overhead, and called again. Walt's voice appeared through the static, shaking and fragmented. He said something very large had just passed the rendezvous point. It hadn't attacked him. It had stopped and looked at him for several seconds, then walked toward the creek. Then it collapsed. Naomi didn't wait for Miguel to finish answering. She turned and ran. The route back to the rendezvous point wasn't far on the map, but in the dark it seemed endless. Naomi slipped twice on wet rock. The second time, one knee struck a root hard, but she pushed herself back up and kept moving. Miguel stayed close behind and called Walt periodically over the radio to maintain contact. Every answer made Naomi run faster. Walt could still see the Sasquatch's chest moving, but he hadn't dared get too close. When they crossed the final line of trees, Walt appeared beneath the beam of a flashlight he had set on a rock. He stood several yards from the creek with both hands hanging at his sides, his face drained of color. In front of him lay the same Sasquatch Naomi had seen from a distance on the hillside. He was lying on his side on damp ground with his back against the roots of a large tree. Even in that position, his size was overwhelming, but nothing was threatening about him now. Gray-brown hair clung wetly to the body. The pale areas around the mouth, hands, and lower legs were even clearer under the flashlight. His chest rose only slightly, and sometimes remained still so long that Walt instinctively stepped forward before seeing the next breath. One arm rested on the ground, the hand open, the fingers moving only slightly. Naomi set her backpack down several yards away. She didn't rush in. A large animal in pain could react violently even while exhausted. She lowered herself into a crouch to make her posture smaller and watched the eyes, ears, and head movement. The Sasquatch opened his eyes at the sound of the backpack zipper. The gaze was unfocused but still turned toward her. He tried to lift his head, then let it fall almost immediately. Miguel held the tranquilizer rifle, but didn't raise it. Naomi shook her head. In this condition, sedation could worsen respiratory depression or cause a dangerous drop in blood pressure. She approached one step at a time, pausing after each short distance. The Sasquatch didn't growl or raise a hand. He only watched her until his eyelids lowered again. Naomi put on gloves and touched the wrist first. The skin beneath the hair felt colder than she expected. She searched for a pulse in the location closest to large primate anatomy and needed several seconds before she found it. The pulse was fast, weak, and slightly irregular. Miguel held the light, while Naomi checked pupil response, surface temperature, mucous membrane color, and breathing rate. The responses were slow. Muscles trembled in waves, even though the ambient temperature wasn't low enough to explain all of it. The signs fit severe exhaustion, dehydration, and probable chronic poisoning. Naomi couldn't determine the extent of kidney or neurological damage without laboratory tests. But the earlier loss of coordination, pigment changes in the hair, current hypothermia, rapid pulse, and slowed responses created a deeply concerning picture. If this Sasquatch had been exposed to the same source as the dead individual, the toxic load had been present long enough that multiple organ systems were beginning to lose the ability to compensate. Walt stood beside them for a moment, then took off his outer jacket. He didn't ask whether he should, he simply handed it to Naomi. She placed it across the Sasquatch's shoulders and chest without covering the airway. Miguel pulled another thermal blanket from the backpack. Together, they worked dry material beneath whatever parts of the body they could reach to reduce heat loss into the ground. The Sasquatch opened his eyes again when Walt pulled the edge of the jacket higher, looked at him for several seconds, then closed them. Naomi checked the distance to the creek. Only a few feet, if the Sasquatch had gone to the water because of thirst or the burning sensation caused by toxic exposure. Choosing Bear Basin itself to drink from could added more contaminants to his system. She told Miguel to use bottled water from the backpack, not creek water. They moistened the Sasquatch's lips and offered only a very small amount, but he swallowed slowly. Naomi stopped immediately rather than risk aspiration. Darkness deepened quickly. There was no cell service. The radio picked up only an intermittent signal from a few higher locations. The nearest vehicle access point was hours away on foot. Even if 4 people had a stretcher, they couldn't carry a body weighing several hundred pounds across that terrain. Naomi checked the time, then watched the Sasquatch's breathing. The investigation was over. This was an emergency now. She needed to restore fluids, maintain body temperature, and move the Sasquatch away from the contaminated area as soon as possible. But there were no established physiological values, no intravenous access already in place, no electrolyte panel, and no cardiac monitor. All Naomi had was her knowledge of large animal medicine, her understanding of anatomy, and a field emergency kit designed for situations far less unusual than the patient lying in front of her. Miguel tried the radio again and climbed onto a higher rock to search for a signal. It wasn't stable enough to request immediate assistance. Walt built a small fire far enough from the Sasquatch to remain safe, shielding 3 sides with stones to reduce wildfire risk. The low flames reflected against wet hair and the exhausted face. The image brought Naomi back to the body, at the bend in the creek, one arm stretched toward the water. She understood that if they waited until morning without intervening, they might be watching the same ending happen again. Naomi pulled the emergency backpack closer. She took out each item one at a time: fresh gloves, a large bore needle, intravenous tubing, securing tape, temperature equipment, and warming packs. At the bottom of the pack was a bag of intravenous fluid intended for large animals, something she had brought only because experience had taught her to prepare for the worst-case scenario. When she lifted it out, her hands were shaking more visibly than they had at any other point that day. She looked at the Sasquatch, breathing shallowly beside the creek, then at Miguel and Walt. There was no other veterinarian. There were no physiological data for this species. There was no chance to delay until a safer protocol appeared. Naomi understood that she was about to perform an emergency procedure with no precedent, right there beside Bear Basin. Naomi set the intravenous fluid bag on a flat rock beside the backpack, checked the expiration date again under her headlamp, then looked at the Sasquatch lying on his side in the low firelight. In nearly 20 years of wildlife forensic pathology, she had made plenty of decisions based on incomplete data, but never with data this incomplete. There were no physiological records, no standard fluid rate guidelines, no reference values for heart rate or kidney function. All Naomi had was experience with large animals, the general principles of circulatory support in suspected heavy metal poisoning, and a body steadily weakening in front of her. If she did nothing, she believed the Sasquatch probably wouldn't survive the night. If she gave fluids too quickly or too aggressively, the treatment itself could make things worse. Miguel knelt behind the Sasquatch's head and placed a rolled blanket beneath the neck to keep the airway aligned and reduce the way the head shifted whenever the body trembled. Walt continued tending the small fire, adding one dry branch at a time to preserve warmth without producing too much smoke. He had rigged a temporary tarp on the windward side so cold air wouldn't blow directly across the Sasquatch lying on the ground. Nobody said much. The creak, the soft crackle of the fire, and the uneven breathing of the patient became the only sounds all three of them listened to. Naomi chose the most accessible vein along the inner forearm. Thick hair made it almost impossible to see, so she used medical scissors to trim a small section and disinfected the skin carefully. The Sasquatch's arm twitched when the cold swab touched it. Miguel held the wrist steady while watching the face for any reaction. Naomi palpated for the vessel, adjusted the needle angle, then paused for 1 second to make sure she wasn't acting simply because she felt rushed. Her hand was shaking, but the moment the needle touched skin, thousands of hours working with large animals replaced the hesitation. She advanced slowly, saw blood return, and then secured the line with medical tape and a soft strap. The fluid bag was suspended from a low branch with a rescue cord. Naomi didn't open the flow wide. She started very slowly and recorded the time, temperature, breathing rate, and pulse before infusion. Every 5 minutes, she checked everything again. She watched the catheter site, mucous membrane color, muscle tremors, and any indication that circulation was worsening. Miguel kept the Sasquatch's head aligned, while Walt was assigned to count respirations for 1 full minute at a time so that, if Naomi was writing or adjusting the line, somebody would still recognize a change immediately. The first 15 minutes gave them no reason to feel better. The pulse remained fast and weak. Body temperature barely increased despite the additional blankets and Walt's jacket. Once, the Sasquatch's hand suddenly contracted hard enough that Miguel thought he was about to wake and rise, but the movement lasted only a few seconds before the arm went limp again. Naomi reduced the fluid rate briefly, checked the heart rhythm, then resumed at a lower level. She wasn't trying to fully treat the cause out there. Her goal was only to stabilize circulation enough to give the kidneys a chance to keep functioning and keep the Sasquatch alive until they could move him away from the contaminated area. About half an hour later, the Sasquatch opened his eyes. This time, the gaze wasn't unfocused. His eyes stopped on Miguel first, then slowly moved to Naomi. She had no idea how much awareness remained, but the look lasted long enough to make her feel that he understood who was touching him. Naomi didn't pull her hand away from his wrist. She stayed where she was and spoke quietly, even though she had no reason to know whether he understood the words. The Sasquatch blinked once, took a deeper breath, then let his head settle back onto the folded blanket. The moment was brief enough to be explained as reflex, but it made Walt turn his face away from the fire for several seconds before returning to his task. After 40 minutes, the breathing began to stabilize. It was still shallow, but the long pauses disappeared. The pulse slowed slightly and no longer raced the way it had at first. Body temperature rose in small increments. Naomi recorded every change out of professional habit, even though part of her knew those numbers might never appear in any scientific paper. She wouldn't call it recovery. It was only evidence that the body hadn't given up. Miguel climbed onto the rocky rise again and tried the radio. This time he stayed up there longer. Naomi heard fragments of his voice cutting through the static, then nothing. When Miguel returned, he said that during their retreat from the grow site earlier, he had briefly caught a narrow signal window and managed to send an emergency request with approximate coordinates. He didn't know whether the entire message had gone through. Naomi checked the time. If it had, the nearest rescue team still needed time to verify the request, prepare, and locate an approach site. If it hadn't, they would have to wait until morning and find another way to move the Sasquatch themselves. Nearly an hour after the fluids started, Walt was the first to hear it. He lifted his head from the fire and tilted it toward the sky. At first, Naomi heard only wind in the canopy. Then a low, steady pulse appeared in the distance, repeating faster than any vehicle engine and growing louder minute by minute. Miguel stood immediately and moved into the open space beside the creek. The sound of helicopter blades rolled down into the valley, disappearing behind the terrain and then returning stronger. Nobody celebrated. Naomi kept her fingers on the Sasquatch's pulse, but for the first time since he collapsed, she felt they had a real path for getting him out. Miguel took a flare and went to mark a clearing nearly 200 yards away, where the trees were sparse enough for a helicopter to approach. He ran ahead to guide the rescue team while Walt stayed with Naomi. The aircraft grew louder until the creek surface began to tremble slightly. The Sasquatch opened his eyes as the sound pressed down into the valley. His body tensed weakly, but Naomi placed one hand on his forearm and held steady, preventing him from trying to rise. A few minutes later, a searchlight swept over the treetops and stopped on Miguel's flare. The rescue team didn't land directly beside the creek. They touched down in the clearing and carried equipment in on a soft-wheeled litter and medical packs. The first person through the trees was a federal rescue specialist who had previously handled the transport of injured large wildlife in mountainous terrain. When he saw the Sasquatch lying beside Naomi, he stopped for the same brief moment everyone else had the first time. Then the surprise disappeared behind procedure. He checked the intravenous line, assessed heart rate, listened to the lungs, measured temperature, and helped Naomi transition the patient to better monitoring equipment. Nobody used the word Bigfoot during those first few minutes. The body in front of them was treated as a large unclassified patient. The rescue team had brought a sling-style litter with multiple support points, normally used for bears or other heavy animals that couldn't move on their own. Transferring the Sasquatch onto it took almost 20 minutes. They had to support the neck, shoulders, and hips at the same time, avoid pulling on the weaker leg, and keep the fluid bag above the catheter site throughout the move. The Sasquatch regained consciousness briefly, several times, but didn't resist. Each time his eyes opened, he looked around as though he couldn't understand the lights or the faces surrounding him. Naomi handed the team leader 3 separate groups of evidence. Tissue from the dead Sasquatch, water samples collected along the upstream route, and the memory card containing photographs of the illegal grow site. She read back the coordinates of the diversion system, the chemical drums, the location where they had observed Krantz, and the place where they had first seen the surviving Sasquatch. Miguel added details about the dirt road, the number of people at the site, and what had happened when they were confronted on the slope. The team leader logged everything into a restricted case file and confirmed that the information would go directly to the Federal Environmental Enforcement Unit. As the litter was moved toward the helicopter, Naomi walked beside it, with one hand on the intravenous line and her eyes fixed on the monitor. Walt followed behind. He had been there from the moment he found the first body beside Bear Basin to the moment the second Sasquatch was carried onto the aircraft. When the helicopter door closed, Walt stood in the rotor, Wash with both hands deep in his coat pockets, and watched the aircraft lift above the clearing and disappear into the darkness over the forest. The Sasquatch was taken to a wildlife care facility, whose location was kept confidential. Naomi went with him and spent the first several hours helping the veterinary team monitor circulation, kidney function, electrolytes, and toxin levels. The results showed prolonged exposure, but not damage beyond recovery. Intravenous fluids continued under close supervision. Feeding began with very small amounts, and by the end of the first week, the Sasquatch could drink on his own and sit upright. Several weeks later, local news reported that federal authorities had dismantled an illegal marijuana operation in the Klamath-Siskiyou region. Silas Krantz and several others had been arrested for investigation of violations involving public land, water resources, and prohibited chemicals. Miguel described only the discovery of a population of large, unclassified animals affected by contamination, enough to expand the investigation without revealing the Sasquatch's location. Naomi received confidential updates showing that kidney function was improving, motor coordination had returned, and new hair was gradually growing back, with its natural darker color. By the end of winter, the treatment team concluded that the Sasquatch was strong enough to return to the wild. Bear Basin was still undergoing restoration, so the release site was moved to a clean creek system deep inside protected wilderness and far from vehicle access. Naomi was invited because she had stabilized him in the field, and she asked Walt to come with her. News about the grow site surfaced later. No reporter knew the investigation had begun with an unidentified body beside Bear Basin. Local coverage only said a federal operation had dismantled a large illegal marijuana grow in the Klamath-Siskiyou region. Aerial images showed hundreds of cultivated plants, an unauthorized water diversion system, multiple chemical containers, and contaminated ground. Silas Krantz and several others were arrested for investigation of violations involving public land, water resources, prohibited chemicals, and illegal cultivation activity. Walt Pruitt stood beside Naomi on the afternoon of the release. The transport enclosure had been positioned with its door facing the forest. The Sasquatch inside looked almost nothing like the individual Naomi had once seen collapsed beside Bear Basin. His shoulders had filled out again, his stance was steady, the gray-brown coat was thicker, and most of the pale areas had been replaced by new, darker hair. When the care team removed the lock, nobody stood directly in front of the opening. The door opened. The Sasquatch didn't rush out. He stood still for nearly half a minute, looking into the forest ahead before turning his head toward the people behind him. His eyes stopped on Naomi. She felt Walt shift slightly beside her, but neither of them moved. The Sasquatch stepped out of the enclosure, placed one foot on the damp ground, then rose to his full height beneath the afternoon light filtering through the trees. He lifted his head and took one long breath, almost as though he were testing the scent of the entire forest. After several steps, he stopped again. He looked at Naomi, then at Walt. There was no dramatic gesture and no unusual sound, only a look that lasted longer than Naomi expected. Then the Sasquatch turned, crossed the strip of ferns, and walked into the forest. Within seconds, the large body disappeared between the trees. A branch moved faintly farther away, and then everything became still. Walt remained silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said he had found one Sasquatch after death had already taken him, and today he had been allowed to watch another walk back into the forest on his own 2 feet. For Walt, that was enough to remember for the rest of his life. Naomi returned to the laboratory, but she never fully returned to the work she had been doing before Bear Basin. She began spending more time on contamination cases in remote wilderness areas, especially reports involving large animal deaths near creek systems where the cause had been recorded vaguely or where too little material had been collected for a conclusion. The 7 older Bear Basin cases remained on her list. Nobody could prove they involved the same species as the Sasquatch Walt found, but Naomi was no longer willing to dismiss unusual patterns, simply because each individual case looked too insignificant when examined alone. Months later, Naomi joined a water survey on a tributary hundreds of miles from Bear Basin. It was routine work, unrelated to Krantz or the earlier investigation. She collected 3 samples at 3 different elevations, ran the field tests, and started packing the equipment away. The 3rd sample made her stop. Conductivity was unusually high. One heavy metal indicator exceeded the regional baseline, and in the preliminary screening, a chemical response appeared in the same compound group she had seen in the Bear Basin samples. Naomi stood beside the creek for a long time, watching clean-looking water move over stones beneath the afternoon light. There was no body on the bank, no oversized tracks in the mud, no evidence that the 2 locations were connected. But she took another sample bottle, then a second one, because Naomi understood that the Bear Basin story might have ended with one Sasquatch surviving and one polluter being arrested. But the problem it revealed may never have belonged to only one valley. The Sasquatch Naomi Reyes saved never received an official name in any scientific record. He existed only as an anonymous entry in a restricted wildlife care report the public would never see. But to Naomi and to Walt, he was living evidence of something they would never be able to prove publicly and no longer felt any need to prove. What troubles me most when I tell this story isn't the image of a giant Sasquatch being saved. It's the number 7. 7 unusual deaths were buried in older case files that nobody ever truly followed to the end until one fisherman happened to walk around the right bend on the right morning. How many other secrets are moving quietly beneath remote streams across this country, waiting for someone to happen across them? If you believe Naomi and Walt's story, leave a comment and let them know. And if the line between an unsolved mystery and a hidden crime can be this thin, how many other things do you think we've never known about? I'm Victor, and I'll see you in the next story.